Okay, so this is the Interpreting in Superior Court Misdemeanor class. Uh, this is a really good class. You're going to like this class a lot. I'm trying to access so I can see your text, the chat function here. All right, so let me join that. Okay, let's see if there's. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Great. Okay, so this is lecture number 1 for the Interpreting in Superior Courts class. And this particular lecture, this particular course is really important. It's very important because this is where I basically start molding you or making you an interpreter. We have learned in the simultaneous course several vocabulary, legal terminology. We continue learning that in the consecutive course. But now it's time to start putting it together in sentences so that that vocabulary becomes more familiar. We're looking now at phrases. Do you remember, for example, in the simultaneous, when we talk about arraignment, there was one particular arraignment when the attorney for the defendant was present, where the judge basically said, "Counsel, do you waive for the reading of the complaint, statement of rights, and enter a not guilty plea?" All right, so that is going to serve us as an example as to what we're going to be doing in this class. Instead of us remembering, when we hear that phrase as an interpreter, you start thinking, okay, how do I say counsel? How do I say waive? How do I say further? How do I say reading of the complaint? How do I say statement of rights? How do I say enter, guilty plea? Instead of remembering all that, we're going to memorize the whole phrase. And we're going to know that whenever the judge says the defendant is present with counsel, that phrase is coming our way. I mean, the interpreter's way. Because when the defendant is present with counsel, the judge is going to use that phrase. So we memorize it as one whole piece. By memorizing as a whole piece, then it gives me the ability to give you a translation of that whole piece in a more stable way, because now instead of looking at individual terms, which when you look at the individual terms, they may be very unstable terms, and you're going to learn that when you take your site translation from English into Spanish course into next quarter actually. By giving you the whole phrase, then I make it a very stable phrase that you memorize as such, and you know when that phrase is going to be used. And when that phrase is used, you hear it, you just interpret into the opposite language right away. So that's why when you were doing the arraignment and you heard the defendant is present with counsel, you in your mind already have to be thinking about that phrase. Licenciado, renuncia a la lectura adicional de la acusación formal, la lectura de derecho constitucional y presenta una declaración de no culpable. Because that's what's coming your way, and I'm not even thinking how to translate or interpret way further on. I'm interpreting the whole phrase. The same thing is going to happen here. This class is all about phrases. Remember, to be able to interpret very, very fast using the simultaneous mode, material that it is so technical as legal terminology, you need to know the whole phrase. You cannot be thinking about each individual word, because it's going to definitely slow you down and you're going to be behind all the time. So the whole point here is memorizing those phrases and also anticipating when those phrases are going to be used. And in the case of an arraignment, whenever we heard the defendant is present with counsel, we now anticipated that phrase, counsel, do you waive for the reading of the complaint, statement of rights, and enter a not guilty plea, will indeed be used. So the point here is for you to, number one, learn the proceeding, what happens in court, and then learn certain triggering, I would say maybe certain identifiable phrases or words that the judge will use that will in turn allow you to predict what are the future expressions going to be used by the judge. So all these things that you're learning in this class are they come from a manual called California Judges Bench Guide. And the California Judges Bench Guide basically has all the it's what's given to the judges when they start working as such. So all those phrases, which are not unique to California, they are used all over the United States, are phrases that you will automatically recognize in when you go and work in the court system. Besides, when you are doing this class, while you're taking this class, you should be very familiar with those. In a way, you're studying to be a judge, to say those phrases in English, or those expressions, or hold those proceedings. We're going to see an example shortly. But also know them in Spanish. So you have to know what the proceeding is about. So if the defendant is entering a guilty plea, you need to know the different stages that are going to be coming in the interpreter, to interpret for the defendant. And within those stages, there are going to be phrases. And you need to know the transfer of those phrases as a phrase, not as individual words. Okay. So that's kind of how we're going to do this class. Now, you need to keep in mind also that when we were looking at pretrial hearing, that was in the simultaneous course. When we're looking at the pretrial hearings, the offer was given to the defendant, and the defendant refused to take that offer. Remember, what do you want to do with this offer? You want to take it or not? He said, no la acepto, quiero un juicio. That was the typical line that we heard in the simultaneous course. Now, in this class, you're going to see that the defendant takes the offer. So we're going to see a lot of different things in this lecture. I have to tell you, this class is really rough. You need to put a lot of time into this class. People that are taking the Site Translation English into Spanish course are still working with material from this class and the next one, which is the felonies. So yeah, and yes, all the terms are translated, okay? In other words, the Judge's Bench Guide, which you're going to have in your lab, is all translated, of course, yeah. Yes, indeed. Good comment, Fausto. I think they are all motivated to continue studying. That's excellent. So let's just look at what's in your course material. Briefly look at that. When you go to your site and you click on the class manual, you're going to get, and you can do that right now, you're going to get this manual, which is a lot more pages than before. And the felony one is like 100 pages, so it just keeps adding up. Okay, keep adding up. So the way that this is presented to you is by lectures. Lecture 1, Lecture 2, Lecture 3, and Lecture 4, just like before. But this is the class manual, and this is one part of the homework. You will also have a homework from the laboratory section of the site. Okay? So in the class manual, what you're going to see is usually forms that are actually required to be interpreted for the Spanish-speaking defendant. See, what happens is that the defendant is given an offer, right, which you already know in the pretrial hearing. And now when the defendant takes the offer, that sets in motion a sequence of events. And the first event that's going to happen is that the interpreter, will read a form to that defendant. And after you completed the whole form, the defendant is going to put the initial in certain boxes, in all the boxes. He's going to sign the form. The interpreter is going to sign the form as well. And that form goes back to the attorney. Those forms that I'm discussing and that you will have to read, usually in the cell, you're reading those forms, all of them, and we'll see how that is done today, are presented to you in this book. And if you go to lecture number 1, you have a misdemeanor plea. It says form number 1, and the title of the form is Misdemeanor Advisement of Rights Waiver and Plea Form. It's a form that you see in court, and it has a color because each of the forms have colors so that attorneys can easily identify them and pull out the correct one. And this is a form where the defendant basically waives and gives up his constitutional rights in writing. And the defendant is advised of certain things, such as if you're not a U.S. citizen, by entering a guilty plea could be a problem to your citizenship in the future. If you're on probation or parole and you enter a guilty plea, that could be a problem in the other case where you were on probation or parole. So there are some advisements here that are written advisements. And those written advisements are read to the defendant by the interpreter. It's kind of what we call sight translation, really. You have a document written in English, and you read it in English, but you're saying it into Spanish verbally for the defendant. And then the defendant puts the initials in the boxes and so on and so forth. So this particular form has all these items. Every box has a number. So here there is no box, but in real life there is a box next to it. And these are the rights, and right below you're going to see the translation of those rights, okay? And then there is another one. Every single thing you see here is translated. So all these numbers you will have to read for the defendant. There are sometimes some numbers that don't apply to the defendant, so where you see the box, there's going to be an X. So it's going to look something like this when you look at the form in court. So you have all names and stuff, and then suddenly here you have number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, 4, 5, and these are the boxes. Sometimes there are going to be like 20, 30 different items here, right? So it goes all the way to maybe 25, 15, 17. It depends on the form. And these are where the initials are supposed to be placed. So if it is Jorge Perez, then the expectation is that for item number 1, the defendant puts JP there. For item number 2, JP. You will see that some forms will have X's like that, placed by the attorney. And when you have an X there, it means you don't have to read anything that is under number 3 because there is no need to put an initial. So you only read whatever is under these in the numbers that don't have an X in the initials boxes. Okay, so after you read all of them, all of the different ones that apply, not the ones that have an X, then you ask the defendant to sign it, and you ask the defendant to put the initials. And we're going to see what procedure you must follow in the cell so that this actually flows in an efficient way, okay? But the important thing is that these are the forms. They are in your book, your class manual, and they have a lot of different numbers. You can see, how many numbers there are here. It goes 20, keep going. Here we go, up to 25. So it's going to look similar to this. There will be another page. They go all the way to, we'll go all the way to number 25, where you're going to have the last box. Now, everything is translated here. Then after that 25, there is a signature for the defendant. And in the real form, we don't have it here because but in the real form, there's also a signature for the interpreter and a place for the attorney to sign, okay? So we will talk about how you tell the defendant how to sign, whether you give or not give any pen or pencil. Let me just tell you, you don't give anything to the defendant, not even the form. That has to go through the bailiff because a pen or a pencil can become a deadly weapon in county jail, and this person is going to be taken back to county jail a few hours later. So those are the forms. So Nalia asked, is there any way to know what color they're in advance? I could let you know, yes, but it's irrelevant because you won't be removing the forms. You cannot touch those forms. The process is that once you are in the cell and the defendant takes the offer, then the attorney is going to give you the form with the X's, right? So it's the attorney who really needs to know what form is what color or what color identifies what type of form. But for us, it's not that critical, although you will eventually memorize it. That changes, those colors change it in different states. In California, there is, you have yellow, you have blue, you have green, you have pink, but the colors will change in different states. So I don't want to necessarily teach that. Oh, I see. To print it in that color. Okay, the first one is going to be blue. If you want to know, the first one is blue, and the second one is green. So those are the two main forms that we are looking at this time. Okay, what cell is this where we would be with the defendant? Well, you will be in a cell. See, if the defendant, so the way it works is that the defendant is arraigned. We already know what the arraignment is, and is taken back to county jail. During the arraignment, the defendant was given the option of deposit a certain amount of money. That's called bail. And if the defendant does that, then the defendant will come back next time to court, but with everybody else through the main door. It's not going to be in the cell. It's not going to be arrested. But if the defendant did not have the money to post that bail, to deposit that amount of money, then what happens is that the defendant is brought this day, right now, for example, brought from county jail and is placed in the cell, which is usually on the side or in the back of the courtroom. You don't see it if you are in the audience. There is a door that leads to the cell. And that cell has the bars, or sometimes a mesh, or sometimes plexiglass that divides where the defendants are located and where you are located. And you have a chair, so you sit down just like me, and you have the form, and the defendant is just across from you. Of course, there are bars. There could be, sometimes there are no chairs. If there are bars, most likely you have to be standing. If there is a chair, it's going to be a mesh and a plexiglass. They don't have windows, glass windows. And then what you will do is you will read the form to the defendant who is behind bar or behind the mesh. So you're not next to the defendant. And then once you finish reading the form, it's crucial that that nothing goes from where you are to where they are. In other words, no pen, no pencil, no paper, no business card, no clip, nothing. Everything must be examined by the bailiff. So once you complete reading the form, you ask the defendant, ¿tiene alguna pregunta? Usually there is none. If there is a question that is a legal question, you need to bring the attorney so that the attorney can answer that question. And then what happens next is that you will say, okay, el alguacil, that's the sheriff, le va a traer el formulario con un lápiz para que usted ponga sus iniciales en estos casilleros, and you show it to them where it should go. And I always tell them, cuando decimos sus iniciales, tiene que poner las iniciales de su nombre. Usted se llama José Pérez, entonces tiene que poner en el número 1, el casillero 1, JP, en el 2, JP, en el 3, JP. The reason why I say that is that sometimes, believe it or not, here's the form, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they say JK, PAK, JK, PAK. So it's supposed to be JP in each one. Okay. So le dice el alguacil se lo va a traer and blah blah blah. And if you have time, you can always be in the cell with them. But the cell doesn't mean that you're inside on that side. You're on this side that leads you to a door that takes you to the courtroom. You can stay there to make sure that he's putting the right initials in the right places. Sometimes they miss one box. So there are several issues that we will be discussing here that are mainly associated with the protocol that must be followed when you are doing those particular forms. Okay, and sometimes it's not just you, there are other interpreters in the cell with you, so we will discuss that later on. So in terms of the class, I always like to divide it into two parts: the class manual and the online lab. Let me show it to you. 1 second, please. Very, very important. Actually, I show you the other one because I'm covering part of that. So the class manual and online lab. I just explained for lecture 1 what's in the class manual. So technically for next week, you have to study this form from lecture 1. And how do you study this? Well, you just basically identified all the English expressions. Look at it from the point of view of a whole sentence more than individual words, or maybe a combination of words like initial the box for each applicable item. That might be one box. If you don't know how to say that in Spanish, create a flashcard for that, and so on and so forth. So the first step here is for you to be able to identify those English words or expressions or sentences that you don't know and create flashcards. So you will read the English, say fill out this form. Okay, I know that. If you wish to plead guilty, what's plead guilty? Okay, so you create a flashcard with plead guilty, and then you find the translation here, declararse culpable, or no contest. What's no contest? No me opongo. So you create another card or another flashcard. Charges against you, from here, initial the boxes. How do I say that? So I create a flashcard that says initial the boxes, coloque sus iniciales, ponga sus iniciales, okay? En el casillero. For each applicable item, you understand, sign it. If you have any questions, the possible sentence, or what sentence? Oh, sentence is condena, right? So the possible sentence, la posible condena. So you create a flashcard. And you do this on a continuous basis. That's the first step. And here you're going to have your rights. And that's another, what do you call it? Important portion of this particular form, because the rights are going to be used not only in this form, but it's going to be used in the when the judge actually admits this plea, okay, accepts the plea from the defendant. So that's how you studied it. And once you have the flashcards, then you study the flashcards. Then you go back and you make sure that now that you have memorized the terms that you didn't know, and you just that's how you make sure that you can do this document. So 2 things: the class manual, or we already know what's for lecture number 1. That's what you're going to study. So for lecture 1, it's, what page would that be? It's from page, it starts on page, sorry to go in this fast here, 3, and it ends on page 9. So it is pages 3 to 9. So we know what we have to study, and we know how to do that. But one of the main things of this class is the online lab. So let's just go to the online lab and see what we have there, okay? So that's you. Okay, that's fine. So let's go to the, that's this class. So we're going to go to the online lab. It's right here. And in the online lab, you're going to see 2 options. You're going to see the simultaneous and consecutive techniques. We put both of them together in case you want to go back. And they're both together. It basically goes week 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5, 6, 7, 8, or something to that effect. Let's check it. When you go there, you have it all the weeks. Remember, we did up to week 4 in the simultaneous, and then week 6 to week 10 is the consecutive class. Okay, but they're all in one page, just to simplify it. So now we're going to go back to the lab. The lab for this class is interpreting in Superior Court misdemeanors. So let's click on it. And here's what you're going to see. These are all the practices for this particular class. Now you have practice on shadowing and on a speed increase. The reason why we have those practices is because you haven't been doing some simultaneous work for a while, although in the last course in the consecutive I did play simultaneous because I know that in this class it's all simultaneous, right? So there is what we call shadowing exercise, which is indicated, the instructions are given, but basically you just hear something in English, you repeat it in English, but you're always 2-3 words behind. So you can do that one time. So if you were to click on it, it's going to tell you that it will take 10 minutes. You can do it as many times up to 3 hours. But so listen to the practice, repeating the same language, make sure you're 3 to 4 words behind the original. So when you hear, if you hear 1, 2, 3, 4, when you hear 3, you're saying uno. When you hear 4, you're saying dos, and so on and so forth. So that will be the first practice. You can do it once or twice. There's another practice to increase the speed, and this you have done it before. It's 11 minutes. I mean, you can spend as many hours as you want, but do this once or twice just to kind of get back into the consecutive mode. So what do you do here? Well, when you hear a question in English, you interpret into Spanish. When you hear the answer in Spanish, you interpret that back into English. If you don't know a term, you skip the term. Just get back into the rhythm of that simultaneous. But the highlight of week number 1 is the California Judges Bench Guide Part 1 that you see right here. Okay, that's the main thing. So far you will be doing those 2 practices initially, kind of an informal manner. But what's very formal and what must be done this week is California Judges Bench Guide Part 1. So let's see what's in there. It's only 10 minutes of practice, but it usually takes about 3 hours to complete it. So now we know in our book here that you're going to do, under week number 1, California Judges Bench Guide, which is applicable for all states. Okay, although it says California. But then what exactly do I need to do? Do you need to do? Well, as it was the case in previous courses, particularly with the arraignment, you have the player to practice with it. But you also have the script for it. And you will click on Download Script. And what you will do first is read the English portion of it. So, for example, calling the case of Juan Rosales. How do I say that? If you don't know it, create a flashcard and you say La Causa de Juan Rosales. What is your true name? Let's say you don't know how to say that. Create a flashcard and then you say ¿Cuál es su nombre verdadero? And so on and so forth. So this is going to be 12 pages. And you're going to first create your flashcards for those 12 pages of all these terms or expressions that you don't know, or sentences rather. So we already know that this is going to be the first thing you're going to do with Judges Bench Guide is download script, B, prepare flashcards, C, study flashcards, D, practice with audio. So what you do is you download the script, as I showed you earlier. You create the flashcards, as I showed you earlier. You study those flashcards. And then once you know them, obviously you should know all that terminology. Then what you're going to do is, I'm going to go back to this, so if you didn't write all of it, don't worry about it. Then what you need to do is, you're in the lab now, you just press this button and you start interpreting. It's going to be exactly the same thing, interpreting simultaneous, obviously. It's going to be exactly the same thing that you see on your on the script. It's going to be exactly this. Okay, it's going to start by saying, "Call in the case of Juan Rosales. Juan Rosales, your true name." Now, what I want to tell you, which this could be kind of shocking, is that the speed the speed here in the lab, it's usually the regular speed in a courtroom. It's quite fast. So when you start practicing with this audio, you're going to find that it is very fast. Well, you have to continue practicing and continue practicing until your ear basically can absorb the original and can predict the words that are, that the transfers. And that's really when you can interpret at that speed. Very, very fast. So it's going to require a lot of practice. So when it comes to the practice portion, practice as many hours as available.